Hi and welcome back to Module 4, The Big Mistake. This is where we dig into the food pyramids and what happened with them. So, food pyramids, I've chosen pyramids because I think they're more evocative than plates like they talk about now. Pyramids have always been a structure of power, and there's nothing more powerful than what you put in your body. So anyway, they aim to teach what to eat and what not to eat. The question is, who decides what goes on those pyramids? And what are the effects? Can we really see the effects of a pyramid? So this is what I was taught when I was growing up. We didn't have pyramids at that point. We had a food quadrants, as we called it. And you can see that 50% of our recommended diet in the 50s was meats and dairies, that kind of thing. And only the rest, the grains, the veggies, the fruit, were only another half of that. So then this one came out around 78, 79, like I said. And those things had been chunked way up. You can see the meat and dairy are near the top there, and then the bottom is filled out with lots of grain, bread, cereals, fruits and veggies, all very carbohydrate-laden food. Kind of gives you a hint of where our problems have come from. And then the new version of the pyramid is the my plate idea. They've put dairy off to the side, just small amounts. And when you dig into what they mean for protein, they're very happy to have vegetarian protein, lentils and stuff, rather than meat. And and lentils have carbohydrate in them too. So in a sense, it becomes almost all carbohydrates. And when you look at the Harvard food pyramid that came out not so long ago and compare that to what happened in ancient Egypt, this is a Harvard food pyramid. You can see red meat's gone up to the top. You can see that the chickens and fishes are eaten, 0 to so many times a week. It's hard for me to read that on my screen at the moment, but it's a small amount. And when you look at the interesting thing about Egypt is they mummified their dead. Every class got mummified. Probably slaves not, but anyone with something, mummification was just part of the process. And so now we can actually look and scan the mummies. We can see what they died of. But this is what they ate. They ate what Harvard would say was the perfect eating scenario: bread, cereals, fresh fruit and veggies, some fish and poultry, almost no red meat, and olive oil instead of lard. Lard's an animal fat made from pigs, and goat's milk for drinking and to make into cheese. So no cow cheese, no cow milk. And that was in Dr. Michael and Mary Dan Eads' book, Protein Power. It was interesting when he wrote that book. They wrote that book. They would rather have called it something else like Fat Power, but the editors didn't think that that would run. It would just be too crazy an idea. So they settled down with Protein Power, but they would have preferred to call it something like Fat Power. But you can see, basically, what's the definition of insanity? Doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. The Egyptians proved it, and we don't need to repeat it. So let's look at the devil. And if there was someone to blame in this whole scenario, I would want to blame Ancel Keys. He did try to change it as tack later on, but it was too late by that time. The wheels were already in motion and no one was stopping them. Nowadays there are a few people trying to put some spanners in those wheels, in the spokes, to stop the whole ball rolling, but that's, I'll tell you about those guys soon. So Ancel Keys came out with this graph, the one on the left, and I'll show you what the difference between that one and the one on the right is on the next slide. But essentially, he had a bee in his bonnet about saturated fat being the bad guy, and he wouldn't let anybody else play. Like I said with Nina Teichholz, he was a big bully. Essentially, he wouldn't let anybody in the nutritional research field unless they were playing in the same sand pit as him. And if you weren't playing in his sand pit, meaning that saturated fat's bad for you, you didn't get the funding. But essentially, he changed the world's diet on studying 33 men not eating their normal diet. They were, Mediterranean. It was Lent, and it was, post-war. And then he looked at epidemiological studies, which we'll hear more about in a minute. And he only showed us, I don't know if he looked at the rest, but he only showed us some. And this is what we saw in medicine in the 70s. We saw this as a graph where heart attack deaths per 1,000 people is on the vertical axis, and the percentage of calories from fat in their diets is on the horizontal axis. So it's plain as day, isn't it? That if that was the only data you were given, you would say, wow, that's phenomenal. Surely, to God, it is that the more fat you eat, the more heart attacks a population has. That's what it looked like. But why didn't he show us these other? These are all epidemiological studies that he could have chosen from. And you can look at that bottom one. You've probably heard of the French paradox, where they eat a lot of saturated fat, but they don't die nearly as much as heart attacks as other people in Western nations. And if you look down at Japan on that bottom left, at the very end of that bottom curve, and if you go across, you'll see number 8 hanging out there on its own. That's France. So France ate 30% of its diet from fat, and I actually believe they eat more, whereas Japan ate only 10%, but they had the same amount of heart attack risk. And therein lies the French paradox, and therein lies the problem of using epidemiological studies as proven scientific ideas. The idea behind an epidemiological study is that that points to an association, and then what you need to do is do a real clinical trial showing, can you prove causation? So the correlation is different to causation. Correlation just means that when you imported more bananas into the country, then the birth rate went up. Did they have anything to do with each other? You don't know until you do the study. So this is what he did was what's called cherry picking data. You may have heard of that before, but basically he chose data, countries that agreed with his beliefs around saturated fat, and he ignored the others. And for a so-called scientist to do that is totally shocking. Hopefully it won't happen today, but it probably does. And so this is another thing to look at. At the same time, he could have also looked at these studies. Remember that graph just shows, when you look at this one, it just shows there, it shows this is about percentage of calories from fat and heart attacks. This next one shows percentage of calories from sugar and all-cause mortality, which is, heart attacks, cancer, strokes, all that kind of stuff. And you can see there's a similar plot, even it's a little tighter even than the black ones are fat and the open circles are sugar. So just to clarify that. So it's fairly similar. There's a spread, isn't there? So there's epidemiological studies, and from there you're supposed to then go and do proper clinical trials. So sugar was implicated at the same time as fat, but he decided there wasn't going to be a context. Remember I said he threw everyone out of a sand pit? He had some help, of course, but I just want you to get that sugar's been implicated all along. And this report came out on September 12, 2016, basically showing how the sugar industry shifted the blame to fat. They didn't want this precious sugar being involved, and so they actually shifted the whole research. And it says in that little piece there that they held back real research for 50 years. Staggering. So research is really skewed. You could say screwed if it's not the right research or if it's not being interpreted right. And this is Dean Ornish. He's famous for the vegan approach to health. He's now started recommending fish oils as a supplement, interestingly enough. But basically, research is skewed to the bias of the person doing the research. And they can be well-meaning people. I'm sure Dean believes in what he's doing. But then you add marketing, political lobbying. Remember I said that Ancel Keys started to change his position, but the politics was already rolling too hard. It rolled right over him in the end. And those things together create major nutrition information wars. And that's where people like this heart surgeon found out that he was willing to change his mind, and he's putting he's left being a heart surgeon to actually do more and more research on the whole process. It's Dwight Lundell. You may have heard of him too. But if you want to get some idea about research being skewed, there's some links in here you can follow. And it just opens your mind and hopefully to the fact that don't trust everything you see in the newspaper. And if you see anything that talks about an observational or an epidemiological study that proves such and such, you can just strike the word proves right out of that, because it doesn't prove it. It proves an association, because there is an association, but it doesn't prove causation. A did not create B necessarily. We need to study to check that. So anytime you now see an epidemiological study come, or the press love those headlines, now you know what to look for to determine whether you're going to even pay any attention to them or not. And it's a sad fact that Upton Sinclair actually got it right. It's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it. And unfortunately, nutrition funding governs what the results are. But we can actually look at the results of the USDA food pyramid. It's interesting that USDA is the US Department of Agriculture, wheat, corn, think about things like that, seed oils. It's got nothing to do with the US Department of Health, has it? It was all you need to think about. Maybe it had more to do with protecting the agricultural department rather than the health department. But let's look at it. Here's a graph. These are adults, and this is an obesity graph. And before 1970, like where this graph starts, it was actually a flat line, right back as far as it went. You know what a flat line is, right? Just no bumps, just that was it. But and you can look at where the low-fat guidelines were instituted, around that 75, 80 time. I can't quite read the things in here. I think 75, 80. And you can see that we were, different age groups. As you got older, you got fatter. But look at what happened after that. It really climbed, basically doubled in that time. And we've seen that. We see it on the streets. People are just bigger. What about kids? Same kind of period of time. Again, flat line before. And look at this. Going from 5%, this is overweight, not obese. So kids going from 5% overweight up to 25 or 20% overweight. And that was, look at that, that's 2003, 2004. We're now 15 years on, plus on from that, and I guarantee you're over that 20% mark now. That's shocking, just shocking. And is it any wonder that we hear about nowadays we have the first generation of kids that are expected to have a shorter lifespan than their parents? It's terrible. It really makes me sick to death, really. And we get an explosion of disease. Overweight and obesity comes with it a whole plethora of disease, including things like diabetes, heart disease, high blood pressure, cholesterol and LDL levels. We'll talk about that in a minute. Stroke, that's basically a heart attack of the brain. Cancer, massive increase in cancer. New Zealand, I think in the last census, our deaths from cancer actually overtook heart attacks. And autoimmune system disorders, things like we never really used to look at. Partly it was we didn't really know about it, but they're just getting massive these days, autoimmune system problems. And then dementia. Did you know that dementia in some circles is called type 3 diabetes? They're realizing the effect of sugar on the brain, long-term sugar use on the brain. And iatrogenic is there. Basically, it's treatment-induced disease. And the treatment we've all been recommended to take is a high-carb, low-fat diet. And that's where I say the people that are still pushing that diet are responsible for you being sick, fat, and tired. This is probably more of an interest piece for, or can understand it, more of an understood piece for New Zealanders and Aussies. This is Gallipoli, the Anzac Cove. For those of you who don't know our history, we have this day every day to celebrate our vets, and we call it Anzac Day, Australia-New Zealand Army Corps. And it it honors the time when we landed a bunch of our troops on the wrong beach in Turkey, and they couldn't get over the top because there was the Turks were on top of it, and they couldn't retreat because they would have been blown out of the water. And they dug in and they spent years there, and it was a hellhole on earth. If there was ever a hell on earth, that was it. So I think about what the food pyramid essentially did to us is it did the same as to all of the population as we did to the military headquarters did to the Anzacs. They stuck them by mistake on the wrong beach, and then they gave them the wrong weapons to fight with, things that they were never going to be able to get off. It was just a massive, massive struggle. And a sicko here, C-I-C-O, do you have any idea what that means? That's what we've been told. It's all about calories in, calories out. So if you're not measuring your calories right, if you're not eating less and exercising more, and you're still getting fat, then it's your problem. The blame has been pushed onto you. But remember what I want to say? The blame is in putting you on the wrong beach and giving you the wrong tools to handle that fight. So eating less, exercising more only leads to more struggle with minimal results and repeated problems. So I really want you to get that. We're going to talk about why that is in the next section. But if you can understand that you've been put on the wrong beach with the wrong tools, you can recognize that lie, then you can be more open to accepting, letting that go, think, well, I've been lied to, that's not going to work, it didn't work, it'll never work, it is just downright wrong. What do I need to do? That's what we're going to cover next.